Hi everybody and welcome back to Exotics of the World TV. Now in this episode we are going to tackle the basic care of the Madagascan day gecko, and in my opinion probably one of the most prettiest geckos there are in the world. So as always, sit back, relax and enjoy the content. These stunning geckos are native to the island of Madagascar, where they can typically be found in humid tropical rainforests. In these rainforests they are often found in like the canopy treetops and also along branches, soaking up that much needed sun. But we'll put a pin in that one and we'll attack that later on in the video. Their habitat is densely packed with all sorts of really large trees, bushes and other kinds of plants and other diverse species of flora, making replicating their enclosures in captivity super fun. A commonly asked question that we get in store is, how big do giant Madagascan day geckos actually get? And they do get a fairly substantial size. So adults can typically reach anywhere from around about 8 to 10 inches. However, some specimens have been recorded to get a little larger than that at around about 12. So, moving on to enclosure size. The bare minimum size enclosure that we recommend for this very active species is a 2 foot long by 2 foot deep by 3 foot tall. However, if you can go larger, as always do so. These animals will utilize their space. As said previously, giant Madagascan day geckos are a super active species. So we've briefly touched on the animal's general habitat, what we can find it out in the wild in. We've touched on its country of origin, and we've briefly touched on the size and the size of the enclosure. Now, moving on to the really vital pieces of kit. This is your life support system. And the first piece of kit that we're going to talk about is, in fact, UVB. Now, what UVB is recommended for this species? We would recommend this species be under a Ferguson Zone 3 bulb. Because this species is out during the day and it is a partial basker, it's going to need a little higher UVI than something that is a little bit crepuscular. So items such as crested geckos or leopard geckos. So the Ferguson Zone Bulb 3 that we recommend to use with the size enclosure of a 3 foot tall. If you go for a taller one, you might need to get something that's a little bit higher rated. This is so that the UVB can penetrate a little bit deeper down into the enclosure. As the UVB is a light emitting source, we would always recommend having a 12-hour on and off cycle. So that is 12 hours on and 12 hours off. This is to simulate a nice photo period for this species. In addition to UVB, we would always recommend the use of LED lighting. Now, at this point, LED, it's not a necessity. However, we would strongly recommend the use of it, especially with a diurnal species such as a Madagascan day gecko. LED doesn't just have benefits for the plants that you're potentially going to put in there if you're going to do like a bioactive kind of enclosure. It's also really good for the animal's overall vision. Something that's also going to be a bit of a benefit to you, having LED in there is really going to make the vibrant colours of this species pop. So aesthetically, it's going to look really good for you, but it's also going to have some really good benefits for that animal's welfare. Moving on to the next piece of vital life support system, and that is your heating. Like with all reptiles, we would always recommend using light emitting heat sources to heat your animal. So the kinds of light emitting heat sources that we would recommend using would be the halogen basking spot bulbs, and you can also use the standard basking spot bulbs also. We here prefer using like the intense basking spots. So Exoterra have a very good intense basking spot bulb, and also so do white python. As this is a light emitting heat source, again, just like your UVB and your LED, we would always recommend having it on for 12 hours and then off for 12 hours. So let's get into the actual specifics. So how hot does it need to actually be? So the basking spot itself, realistically, you want it anywhere from around about 30 to 35 degrees. That's like directly under the bulb itself. And then the warm side, you kind of want high 20s. So anywhere from around about 29 to around about 27. And then on the cool side, you kind of want it like 24 to about 20. The reason why we have a varying degree of temperatures inside this enclosure, also known as a thermal gradient, is so that the animal can thermoregulate. So if it's a little bit too warm, it can go to the cooler sides and it can cool off. If it's a little bit cold, it can go to the warm side and obviously warm up. However, this might be trial and error. If you're noticing that your day gecko is spending quite a lot of time under the heat bulb, it's probably a little bit too cold in there. The same can be said for the opposite. If you're noticing that that your day gecko is on the cool side or at the bottom of the enclosure constantly, it's probably a little bit too warm in there. So again, it's all a bit of trial and error. Try and find that animal's sweet spot. So definitely pay attention to your animal's body language and overall behavior. So what are we going to do about nighttime heating and temperatures? Well, this is going to depend on how warm your house is. Most houses, especially in the UK, they should sit around about 18 degrees or so. Now, this is perfectly fine to have them cool down on a nighttime too. However, if you are from a really cold place in the world, or even in the UK, if your house isn't that efficient at keeping the heat in and it's dropping below 18 degrees, you might need to get an additional heat source. Now, what additional heat source would we typically recommend? So, products such as like ceramic heat bulbs are really good at keeping ambient temperatures. Now, ceramic heat bulbs shouldn't really be used in replace of basking spots. Ceramics should literally be used just for ambient temperatures only. Moving on to what is going to control our heating in there. So I alluded to it a little bit earlier. This section is now about thermostats. And there are 3 different kinds of thermostats that are on the market. There is your on-off stat, which is primarily designed for things like heat mats, but you can arguably use a ceramic heat bulb on there. You then have the pulse proportional, which are designed to be used alongside with your ceramic heat bulbs, and then you have your dimming thermostat. Any light emitting heat source needs to be on a dimming thermostat. The other 2 that I mentioned, so like the on-off or the pulse proportional, if you were to put a light emitting heat source on there, it would literally be like a disco in there for that animal. And that was it for the section on the life support systems. Now, moving on to humidity. Humidity is vital in the care of giant Madagascan day geckos. We wouldn't really recommend dropping that humidity below 70%, but anywhere from 70 to 90% in that range is absolutely fine for your gecko. So why is it really important for this species? So this is going to be one of the main ways these animals are going to hydrate. Another vital role humidity plays in this animal's day-to-day running is when it goes into shed. So the higher humidity, the easier it's going to be for this animal to shed its excess skin. To ensure that your humidity does stay high, you can get a hygrometer. So this is going to tell you how humid it is inside the enclosure. We would always recommend getting a digital hygrometer as well, as these are a lot more accurate than like the standard little dial ones. So to increase the humidity, what we would recommend is just spraying inside the enclosure. You can do this manually, or you can get misting systems that will take the effort out for you. What you can also do is add a fogging system in there, but please note that both the misting system and especially the fogging system will need to have regular maintenance and be cleaned out more regular. So something else that is kind of linked to humidity is your substrate. Now, the thicker the substrate that you have in there, the easier it's going to be to regulate that humidity. And the types of substrate that we would recommend in an enclosure for a giant Madagascan day gecko would be anything from like cocoa fiber. You can use topsoils. You could use some of the branded items like the ProRep BioLife Forest. There is also the Lucky Reptile Jungle Mix. There are loads of different kinds of substrates in there. What we would always say is don't just stick to one kind of substrate. Always mix them about, mix them in with each other. A combination that we really like to use is the ProRep BioLife Forest alongside the Arcadia Earth Mix, especially if you're going to be using live plants in your enclosure. I feel personally that these like really complement each other in terms of like nutrients and as well aesthetic. If your enclosure is fairly large and you want something to kind of like bulk it out with, you can use topsoil and you can also use cocoa fiber. Another item that you can add into this enclosure as well to help maintain the humidity and as well give it that really nice like jungly aesthetic is in fact leaf litter. Now, leaf litter doesn't just look nice, it's going to aid in like locking in that humidity for your substrate, therefore making the whole enclosure more humid. The leaf litter itself is also very beneficial for your isopods, especially if you're going to be having a bioactive enclosure. Let's now talk about the giant Madagascan day gecko's diet. So these guys are omnivorous, meaning that they will eat items such as insects and they'll also eat fruits and vegetables as well. Now, we have obviously access to live food, so things like crickets, locusts, waxworms, mealworms, all sorts of bits and bobs like that. That's absolutely fine to feed them. If you want to do a little bit of food enrichment for them, you can also get like the waxworms and the calciworms and you can keep them and let them pupate into their kind of like moth and soldier fly form. Once these guys have pupated mutated into their final form, you can then release them into the enclosure and you can watch the day gecko chase them around. Not only is it going to be fun for you to watch, but it's also fun for the animal to try and chase them and also exhibit some natural behaviors. The second part of the diet for this species is their pre-mixed foods. So brands such as Blue River Diet, Arcadia's got some day gecko food out as well, Pangea, Rapashi, like the old school kind of ones, absolutely fine to use with your day gecko. Now, with the pre-mixed food, what we would always recommend is swap and change. You don't want to have the gecko on one thing all the time. This is where we find animals will start to become a little bit picky. As we've just spoken about the diet, we can now talk about supplementation and supplementation regime. If you just want to go for a bog standard, you can literally just use most calcium and multivitamin powders. These need to be sprinkled on the food every single time that you feed your animal. Now, I absolutely love day geckos. However, if you're wanting a gecko that you can kind of like handle and get out, a day gecko might not be the one for you. These guys are incredibly fast and really don't like to be touched. Sometimes you might get away with it and happen upon a gecko that doesn't mind being handled or picked up and might seem to enjoy interacting with people, but on the whole, this species really doesn't like the interaction. And because of this, it is really important that we now talk about their decor. So in terms of decor, you can have lots and lots of fun with this. Now, I prefer using more like kind of like naturalistic things. I am a really big proponent for like bioactive setups and using live plants and whatnot. However, if you don't want to go down that line, as long as the animal can interact with like the decor items of your choice that you've placed in there in a safe and novel way, then it will be absolutely fine. So a lot of companies you'll find will do like the plastic fake plants and whatnot. Again, absolutely fine to use. The more coverage that you've got in there, the safer the animal is going to feel. And the safer the animal is going to feel, realistically, the more it's going to be out on display. So we've spoken about foliage. Now it's time to talk about the hardscape pieces in your enclosure. So this is going to be items such as cork bark. You can use Talawa woods. You can use Redmore woods. Anything like that, really. And that about wraps us up for this video. So thank you very much if you guys have stayed all the way to the end. Please make sure that you give us a like, share, and a subscribe, and also ping the bell icon just so you get notified when we release new videos. And on that bombshell, I've been Ash, and thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next one. Ta-ra!